Hello, welcome. It was very interesting. The YouTube quality was so incredibly bad. I don't understand how or why, um, but it was a good experiment. Yes. Okay, well, good morning. And without further ado, I will read chapter 2 of The Time Machine. Let's get into it. Chapter 2. I think that at that time none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time traveler was one of those men who are too clever to be believed. You never felt that you saw all around him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush. Behind his lucid frankness. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter in the time traveller's words, we should have shown him far less skepticism, for we should have perceived his motives. A pork butcher could understand Philby. But the time traveller had more than a touch of whim among his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the fame of a lesser man seemed tricks in his hand. It is a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never quite felt sure of his deportment. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I don't think any of us said very much about time travelling in the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most our minds. Its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anachronism and of utter confusion suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model that I remember discussing with the medical man whom I met on Friday at the Linnean. He said he had seen a similar thing in Tübingen, and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle, but how the trick was done he could not explain. The next Thursday I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveller's most constant guests, and, arriving late, found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked around for the time traveller. "It's 7:30 now," said the medical man. "I suppose we'd better have dinner." "Where's—" said I, naming our host. "You've just come. It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. He asked me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes." "Seems a pity to let the dinner spoil," said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and thereupon the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only person besides the doctor and myself who had attended the previous dinner. The other men were Blank, the editor aforementioned, a certain journalist, and another, a quiet, shy man with a beard, whom I didn't know, and who, as far as in my observation went, never opened his mouth at all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveller's absence, and I suggested time travelling in a half jocular spirit. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick that we had witnessed that day week He was in the midst of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened slowly, and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. "Hello," I said. "At last!" And the door opened wider, and the time traveller stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens! What's the matter?" And the whole table turned towards the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty, and smeared with green down the sleeves. His hair disordered, and it seemed to me greyer, either with dust and dirt, or because its colour had actually faded. His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, and cut half healed. His expression was haggard and drawn. It's as by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I have seen in footsore tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it towards him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked around the table, and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time traveller did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said with a certain faltering articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off. "That's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint colour came to his cheeks. His glance flickered over our faces with a certain dull approval, and he went around the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again. Still as it were feeling his way among his words, I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain some things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat." He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. "Tell you presently," said the time traveller. "I'm funny. Be all right in a minute." He put down his glass and walked towards the staircase door. Again I remarked his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall. And standing up in my place, I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. Then the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow, till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute, perhaps, my mind was wool-gathering. Then, "Remarkable behaviour of an eminent scientist," I heard the editor say, thinking after his wont in headlines, and this brought my attention back to the bright dinner table. "What's the game?" said the journalist. "Has he been doing the amateur cadger? I don't follow." I met the eye of the psychologist and read my own interpretation in his face. I thought of the time traveller limping painfully upstairs. I don't think anyone else had noticed his lameness. The first to recover completely from this surprise was the medical man, who rang the bell. The time traveller hated to have servants waiting at dinner. Waiting at dinner for a hot plate. And that the editor turned to his knife and fork with a grunt. And the silent man followed suit. The dinner was resumed. Conversation was exclamatory for a while, with gaps of wonderment, and then the editor got fervent in his curiosity. Does our friend eke out his modest income with a crossing, or has he his Nebuchadnezzar phases? He inquired. I feel assured it's this business of the time machine, I said, and took up the psychologist's account of our previous evening. The new guests were frankly incredulous. The editor raised objections. What was this time travelling? A man couldn't cover himself with dust by rolling around in paradox, could he? And then, as the idea came home to him, he resorted to caricature. Hadn't they any clothes brushes in the future? The journalist, too, would not believe at any price, and joined the editor in the easy work of heaping ridicule on the whole thing. They were both the new kind of journalist, very joyous, irreverent young men. Our special correspondent in the Day After Tomorrow reports, the journalist was saying, or rather shouting when the time traveller came back. He was dressed in ordinary evening clothes, and nothing save his haggard look remained of the change that had startled me. "I say," said the editor hilariously, "these chaps here say you've been travelling into the middle of next week." "Tell us all about little Roseberry, will you? What will you take for the lot?" The time traveller came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly, in his odd way. "Where's my mutton?" he said. "What a treat it is to stick a fork into meat again." "Story!" cried the editor. "Story be damned," said the time traveller. "I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some peptone into my arteries. Thanks. And the salad." "One word," said I. "Have you been time travelling?" "Yes," said the time traveller, with his mouth full and nodding his head. "I'd give a shilling a line for a verbatim note," said the editor. The time traveller pushed his glass towards the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively and poured him wine. The rest of the dinner was uncomfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept on rising to my lips, and I dare say it was the same with the others. The journalist tried to relieve the tension by telling anecdotes of Hetty Potter. The time traveller devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite for tramp. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the time traveller through his eyelashes. The silent man, even more clumsy than usual, and drank champagne with regularity and determination out of sheer nervousness. At last, the time traveller pushed away his plate and looked around us. "I suppose I must apologize," he said. "I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time." He reached out his hand for a cigar and cut the end. "But come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates." And ringing the bell in passing, he led the way to the adjoining room. "You have told Blank and Dash and Chose about the machine," he said to me, leaning back in his easy chair and naming the 3 new guests. "But the thing's a mere paradox," said the editor. "I can't argue tonight. I don't mind telling you the story, but I can't argue." "I will," he went on, "tell you the story of what has happened to me, if you like, but you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it badly. Most of it will sound like lying. So be it. It's true, every word of it. All the same, I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock, and since then I've lived 8 days. Such days as no human being ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out, but I shan't sleep till I've told you this thing over to you. Then I shall go to bed, but no interruptions. Is it agreed?" "Agreed," said the editor, and the rest of us echoed, "Agreed." And with that, the time traveller began his story, as I have set it forth. He sat back in his chair at first and spoke like a weary man. Afterwards he got more animated. In writing it down, I feel with only too much keenness the inadequacy of pen and ink, and above all, my own inadequacy to express its quality. You read, I will suppose, attentively enough, but you cannot see the speaker's white, sincere face in the bright circle of the little lamp, nor hear the intonation of his voice. You cannot know how his expression follows the turns of the story. Most of us hearers were in shadow, for the candles in the smoking room had not been lighted, and the only face of the journalist and the legs of the silent man from the knees downward were illuminated. At first we glanced now and again at each other. After a time we ceased to do that, and looked only at the time traveller's face. Chapter 3. I told some of you last Thursday of the principles of the time machine, and showed you the actual thing itself, incomplete, in my workshop. There is now a little travel-worn, truly, and one of the ivory bars is cracked and the brass rail bent. But the rest of it's sound enough. I expect to finish it on Friday, but on Friday, when the putting together was nearly done, I found that one of the nickel bars was exactly 1 inch too short, and this I had to get remade, so that the thing was not complete until this morning. It was at 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol on his knees feels much the same wonder at what will come next as I felt then. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping one in the other, pressed the first and almost immediately the second. I seemed to reel and and felt a nightmare sensation of falling. And looking around, I saw the laboratory exactly as before. Had anything happened? For a moment I suspected that my intellect had tricked me. Then I noted the clock. A moment before, as it seemed, it had stood at a minute or so past 10. Now it was nearly 3:30. I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Ms. Vuxted came in and walked, apparently without seeing me, towards the garden door. I suppose it took her a minute or two to traverse the place, but to me she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position. The night came in like the turning of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter and even fainter. Tomorrow night came black, and day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb, confused descended my mind. I'm afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like one has upon a switchback of a helpless, headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an imminent smash as I put on pace. Night followed day like the flappings of a black wing. The dim sensation of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping it every minute, and every minute marking a day. I supposed the laboratory had been destroyed, and I had come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things. The slowest snail that ever crawled dashed by, too fast for me. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then, in the intermittent darkness, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of day and night merged into one continuous greyness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous colour like that of an earthly twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space. The moon a fainter fluctuating band, and I could see nothing of the stars. save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still on the hillside upon which his house stands, and the shoulder rose above me, grey and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapour. Now brown, now green, they grew, spread, shivered, and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up, faint and fair, and pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed changed, melting and flowing under my eyes. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed raced round faster and faster. Presently I noted that the sun belt swayed up and down from solstice to solstice in a minute or less, and that consequently my pace was over a year a minute, and minute by minute the white snow flashed across the world and vanished, and was followed by the bright, brief green of spring. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged at last into a kind of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked, indeed, a clumsy swaying of the machine for which I was unable to account, but my mind was too confused to attend to it. So with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. At first I scarce thought of stopping, scarce thought of anything but these new sensations. But presently a fresh series of impressions grew upon my mind. A certain curiosity, and there with a certain dread, until at last they took complete possession of me. What strange developments of humanity, what wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization, I thought, might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim, elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time. And yet, as it seemed, built of glimmer and mist, I saw a richer green flow up the hillside, and remain there without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair, and so my mind came round to the business of stopping. Peculiar risk lay in the possibility of my finding some substance in the space which I, or the machine, occupied. So long as I travelled at a high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered. I was, so to speak, attenuated. It was like slipping a vapour through the interstices of intervening substances. But to come to a stop involved a jamming of myself, molecule by molecule, into whatever lay in my way. It meant bringing my atoms to such an intimate contact with those of the obstacle that a profound chemical reaction, possibly a far-reaching explosion, would result, and blow myself and my apparatus out of this all possible dimensions into the unknown. This possibility had occurred to me again and again while I was making the machine, but then I had cheerfully accepted it as an unavoidable risk. One of the risks a man has got to take. Now that the risk was inevitable, I no longer saw it in the same cheerful light. The fact is that, insensibly, the absolute strangeness of everything, the sickly jarring and swaying of the machine, above all, the feeling of prolonged falling, had absolutely upset my nerve. I told myself that I could never stop. With a gust of petulance, I resolved to stop forthwith. Like an impatient fool, I lugged over the lever, and incontinently the thing went reeling over, and I was flung headlong through the air. There was a sound of a clap of thunder in my ears. I may have been stunned for a moment. A pitiless hail was hissing around me, and I was sitting on soft turf in front of the overset machine. Everything still seemed grey, but presently I remarked that the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked around me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in a garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes, and I noticed that their mauve and purple blossoms were dropping in a shower under the beating of the hailstones. The rebounding, dancing hail hung in a cloud over the machine, and I drove along the ground like smoke. In a moment I was wet to the skin. "Fine hospitality," said I, "to a man who has travelled innumerable years to see you." Presently I thought, what a fool I was to get wet. I stood up and looked around me. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly above the rhododendrons through the hazy downpour. But all else of the world was invisible. My sensations would be hard to describe as the columns of hail grew thinner. I saw the white figure moo more distinctly. It was very large, for a silver birch tree touched its shoulder. It was of white marble, but shaped something like a winged sphinx. But the wings, instead of being carried vertically at the sides, were spread so that it seemed to hover. The pedestal, it appeared to me, was of bronze and was thick with verdigris. Verdigris? What's the word? It chanced that the face was towards me. The sightless eyes seemed to watch me. There was the faint shadow of a smile on the lips. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imparted an unpleasant suggestion of disease. I stood looking at it for a little space, half a minute perhaps, or half an hour. It seemed to advance and to recede as the hail drove before it denser or thinner. At last I tore my eyes from it for a moment and saw that the hail curtain had worn threadbare, and that the sun was lightening in with promise. I looked up again at the crouching white shape, and the full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What might appear when the hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn? What might not have happened to men? What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? And what if in this interval the race had lost its manliness and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, and overwhelmingly powerful? I might seem some old-world savage animal, only the more dreadful and disgusting for our common likeness, a foul creature to be incontinently slain. Already I saw other vast shapes, huge buildings with intricate parapets and tall columns with a wooded hillside dimly creeping in upon me through the lessening storm. I was seized with a panic fear. I turned frantically to the time machine and strove hard to readjust it. As I did so, the shafts of the sun smote through the thunderstorm. The grey downpour was swept aside and vanished like the trailing garments of a ghost. Above me, in the intense blue of the summer sky, some faint brown shreds of cloud whirled into nothingness. The great buildings about me stood clear and distinct, shining with the wet of the thunderstorm, and I picked out in white by the unmelted hailstones piled along the courses. I felt naked in a strange world. I felt as perhaps a bird may feel in the clear air, knowing the hawk wings above will swoop. My fear grew to frenzy. I took a breathing space, set my teeth, and again grappled fiercely, wrist and knee, with the machine. It gave under my desperate onset and turned over. It struck my chin violently on one hand of the saddle, and other on the lever. I stood panting heavily in attitude to mount again. But with this recovery of a prompt retreat, my courage recovered. I looked more curiously and less fearfully at this world of the remote future. In a circular opening, high up in the wall of the nearer house, I saw a group of figures clad in rich, soft robes. They had seen me, and their faces were directed towards me. Then I heard voices approaching me, some through the bushes by the white sphinx, where were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged in a pathway leading straight to the little lawn upon which I stood with my machine. He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic, gilded at the waist with a leather belt. Sandals or buskins, I could not really distinguish which, were on his feet. His legs were bare to the knees, and his head was bare. Noticing that, I noticed, for the first time, how warm the air was. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive, that hectic beauty of which we used to hear so much. At the sight of him, I suddenly regained confidence. I took my hands from the machine. And that's the end of chapter 2 and chapter 3. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you at the next reading on Twitch.